Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan. I am a solutions architect with StratusGrid. StratusGrid is a premier consulting partner with AWS, and we're also an ISV that provides a software as a service tool known as Stratosphere. Stratosphere is a cost optimization tool that is designed for private equity firms and large enterprises that helps you to unearth cost savings opportunities across your entire AWS environment and then take action on those cost savings opportunities so that you can optimize the value that you're getting out of the cloud. So what I wanted to talk about in this particular video is just kind of a high level overview of the different governance and compliance services that are available in Amazon Web Services. Now, if you take a Wild West approach to doing resource management in the cloud, then you're going to quickly find that you've got resource sprawl. That's what I like to call it, where you've got resources sprawling all over the place across different accounts, across different regions, across different services, some of which may or may not have been approved with your business. And so, what we want to do is kind of put these safety guardrails around the regions that we're allowing engineers to deploy in, or around the accounts that we're allowing engineers to deploy in, or even around the specific services that we as a business are taking advantage of in Amazon Web Services. As you probably know, there are hundreds of different services available in AWS. There's compute services, container services, database services, web services, there's satellite services. There's just tons and tons of different services and capabilities inside of AWS. And so, what we want to do is make sure that we put guardrails in place so that we don't just allow engineers to go out and provision any resource across any service in any region, in any account. And that ultimately leads to this resource sprawl where we don't even know what we have because we'd have to go out and inventory everything on an individual service and individual region basis in order to figure out what we have so that we can then go and clean up anything that we don't need. So, to avoid getting into that situation in the first place, where you have to do some massive cleanup project or program, then we can use some of these management and governance services in AWS to put those guardrails in place. So, the way that I got to this page, if you're interested in following along in your browser, is aws.amazon.com. And then if you go to products, there is a management and governance section. So you can just click on this heading right here, and this will take you right over to the management and governance page. So this page here is going to list out some of the different services that are available in Amazon Web Services for the purposes of management and governance. Now, there is some overlap with some other areas or some other practice areas like observability, for example. But remember that there is a lot of overlap in these services just in general. So it kind of makes sense that certain services may appear in multiple locations. In any case, I wanted to start out by talking about AWS organizations because when you're operating AWS at scale, the AWS organization service is going to help you to manage multiple accounts inside of what are called organizational units. You can kind of think of an OU kind of like a folder that contains multiple AWS accounts, and then you can apply certain policies to the OU, and those policies will apply to the entire folder. So if you as an organization decide strategically that, hey, we're not using services like the satellite ground station service here, right? Probably most companies are not going to be leveraging the AWS ground station service or other services like Quantum Ledger or Amazon Bracket, experiment with quantum computing. If you as an organization are simply not taking advantage of some of these services in AWS, then you'll probably want to apply a policy at the organization's level on those individual organizational units that apply to your entire set of accounts so that you can block access to certain services. You can also do the same thing with regions. You can block access to certain AWS regions. The way that you can do that is with a special type of policy called a service control policy. So if you ever hear somebody talk about SCPs or service control policies, that's what they're referring to, these policies that you can apply to your organizational units that create these boundaries or these guardrails around blocking access to certain services and blocking access to certain regions that you as an organization are not strategically using. So make sure that if you're not using organizations that you sign up for it today, make sure that you activate organizations in your AWS environment. Even if you only have a few AWS accounts, that's totally fine. There isn't any extra charge for using this particular service. So it's a really nice management service that helps you to create these guardrails around your accounts. Something else you want to take advantage of are AWS budgets. What budgets basically are is it's a mechanism for you to set a cost threshold. So if your standard spend is, let's say, $2,000 a month, and you have an anomaly that causes your spend to go up to maybe $2,500 a month, you can set a budget at something like $2,200. And so if your costs exceed that budget for that particular month, if it does spike past 2,200 and go all the way up to 2,500, then you can get an alert through the AWS budgets tool to notify you that your budget has been exceeded. And that helps create some guardrails around cost control inside of your AWS account. Another service that is in the management and governance section here is the CloudFormation service. So what's really nice about AWS CloudFormation is that you can create these templates of infrastructure and applications, and you can deploy those entire templates out to your AWS account. CloudFormation templates are built in either JSON or YAML syntax. So they're basically just these plain text code files that you can check into a version control system like Git. Maybe you as an organization are using GitHub or GitLab or something of that nature to store your source code. You can check in those CloudFormation files into your source code repository, version control them, do pull requests on them, do peer reviews, and all that kind of stuff on your CloudFormation template files, and then deploy those templates out. And so CloudFormation allows you to templatize all of your deployments and then just deploy those centrally by deploying that single template rather than having to go out to each individual service and manually provisioning each of the resources that is made up in that template. So a template could have maybe 50, 60, 100 different resources inside of it, and that can be deployed as a singular stack. Now, very closely associated with CloudFormation is the AWS Service Catalog service. And Service Catalog allows you to basically ingest these CloudFormation templates and then share them out with your development teams so that what they can do is take those CloudFormation templates, just suck them into Service Catalog, and then you can delegate that access to different types of roles like developers, data scientists, other types of consumers who are provisioning cloud resources, and you can make those templates available to them through a standardized interface, which is Service Catalog. And that way, they won't have access to change the templates. They won't have access to actually modify the source code for the actual CloudFormation templates that you're ingesting, but they can go out to Service Catalog and find the stack that they need to deploy, and then they can go out and provision an instance of that stack by using the Service Catalog service. So that gives you access control over publishing certain stacks, CloudFormation stacks, to your end users in the cloud. Another service around governance is the AWS Marketplace service, and StratusGrid actually leverages the Marketplace service. So if we go over to Marketplace here and just do a search for StratusGrid, the AWS Marketplace essentially allows you to purchase certain software products and licenses through a standardized interface so that these products and services will actually show up on your AWS bill. You don't have to set up a separate billing relationship with each individual vendor as long as you're just purchasing those products and services directly through the AWS Marketplace. There's a lot of value to that. In fact, our own product called Stratosphere shows up right down here. You can either search for Stratosphere or search for StratusGrid here, and you'll see that Stratosphere, our cost optimization tool, actually shows up right here in the AWS Marketplace. So if you're interested in purchasing access to Stratosphere to do a cost optimization project and to just ensure the ongoing cost health of your AWS environment, then you can just purchase it straight through the AWS Marketplace. And that is a really nice control because it centralizes your spend inside of your AWS environment. All right, back to the list of services here. Amazon CloudWatch is more of an observability service. It actually encompasses a whole bunch of different services like metric storage, logs storage, charting and graphing for your metrics. There's log insights. There's container insights as well that allows you to get insights into container workloads that are running on services like Amazon Elastic Container Service or ECS and Fargate and things of that nature. So CloudWatch is all about observability, but there's actually lots of services that integrate with CloudWatch. So for example, CloudTrail is a service that actually shows up right over here that captures audit data about your account, and it can actually emit that audit data directly into Amazon CloudWatch logs so that you can see in kind of near real time what's happening inside of your AWS account. So let's actually talk about CloudTrail in a little bit more detail here, because this is an essential service for anybody who's interested in management, governance, and observability of what's happening inside of their AWS environment. If you don't have CloudTrail enabled, you need to enable it today, because what CloudTrail does is it gives you this audit trail of everything that's happening inside of your AWS account at the control plane, as well as the data plane for certain services. So, what is an example of something that would be considered a control plane, right? Well, if I create an EC2 instance, or if I stop an EC2 instance, or if I create a VPC, or I add a subnet to an existing VPC, or I make a change to a route table that's associated with a bunch of subnets, any of those types of control plane changes that I make to resource configurations inside of my AWS account are going to be captured as management plane or control plane level events inside of the CloudTrail service. Now, what is considered a data event, right? So we have control plane events and we have data events. And so a data event could be something like somebody writing an S3 object into an S3 bucket, or deleting an S3 object from an S3 bucket, or copying an S3 object between two different buckets, right? Or in the Amazon DynamoDB service, it could be creating a new item inside of a DynamoDB table. It could be deleting an item out of a DynamoDB table. It could be updating an existing item in a DynamoDB table and things of that nature. Now, the actual creation of an S3 bucket, or deletion of an S3 bucket, or creating a Dynamo table or deleting a Dynamo table, those would be considered management plane or control plane level events, whereas the data events are the actual items inside of a bucket, or objects in a bucket, or items inside of a DynamoDB table. So CloudTrail gives you that audit visibility into every event that's happening at that very granular level across all sorts of different AWS services. Another interesting service in the management and governance section here is called AWS Config. This is actually a service that I'm really interested in, particularly because what AWS Config allows you to do is to audit the configurations of your AWS resources. So this works for many different resource types in AWS. It works for things like VPCs, subnets, it works for things like EC2 instances and all sorts of different resources like that. So what it does for starters is it actually goes out and it gathers all of your resource configurations for any of the supported resources. So it'll actually inventory and say, hey, I see there's a EC2 instance with this ID and this instance type, and it has this IP address, and it has this network interface configuration, and all sorts of things like that. And so what you can then do with that inventory data that you're getting back in AWS Config here is actually develop these custom rules that get evaluated on a periodic basis to determine if a resource is in compliance with the desired configuration. In some other services, this is a feature known as desired configuration management, or DCM for short, where you set kind of a rule that determines what your desired state is, and then the system, in this case, it's AWS Config here, is actually evaluating your various resources against those set of rules, and it's determining, are these resources compliant or not compliant with these set of rules that I have designated. To give you an example of a rule, I could say that all of my EC2 instances must be T3 mediums. And if I provision a T3 X large instance, then that's going to be considered non-compliant. And in order to fix that, I could either delete the instance, I could resize the instance to T3 medium, or I could actually update the rule and include T3.X large in my list of supported instance types. So it's just a way for you as an end user to determine what does a supported compliant resource look like, and then you can actually go out and write the rules to determine if those resources are compliant or not compliant based on your organization's policies. So AWS Config is a really great service for that purpose. So what we're going to talk about now is AWS Systems Manager. AWS Systems Manager is a really interesting service because what it does is it gives you control over your EC2 instances, for example, so you can actually connect the Systems Manager agent that runs on EC2. You can connect that into AWS Systems Manager, and then you can deploy things like automation scripts out to your EC2 instances. There's actually lots of other capabilities inside of Systems Manager as well, just like CloudWatch has, metrics and logs, container insights and dashboards, graphs, all things of that nature. Systems Manager is kind of in the same boat where it's this umbrella service that encompasses lots of different interesting types of functionality. But one of the most essential capabilities of Systems Manager is the ability to centrally manage EC2 instances by leveraging the Systems Manager agent. So the Systems Manager agent connects to the Systems Manager service backend APIs, and it periodically is checking for new instructions to see if there's any new instructions or automation scripts that need to be deployed out to that EC2 instance. And that makes it really easy to do things like run operating system package upgrades and deploying inventory scripts or deploying automation scripts that go out and remediate issues on EC2 instances and things of that nature. It works on both Windows and Linux instances, so that's really nice, and it just gives you that centralized control over your infrastructure. Another key capability of Systems Manager is a feature called Session Manager, which allows you to get an interactive shell into an AWS Fargate container, for example, using ECS exec. And it also allows you to get an interactive shell on Linux instances, for example, so that rather than having to have direct SSH access to TCP port 22, you can actually just launch a web browser, go into the AWS Management Console, and have IAM authenticated access to the shell on one of those virtual machines. So it's a really cool service with a lot of interesting capabilities. All right, let's talk about AWS cost and usage. So you can go over into the billing section of your portal. So when you're signed into the console in AWS, you can go to the top right corner and choose the billing option. And then under that billing option, you can actually run various types of reports against your cost and usage reporting or CUR data in AWS. And that gives you a very granular insight into, what services am I spending the most on? How did my spend compare day to day or month to month or week to week and things of that nature. So those reports are very insightful. It gives you a great breakdown of where you're actually spending money on various cloud resources, and that can help you to cost optimize your entire AWS environment as well. So as you can see, there are lots of different management and governance services available. Some of the top ones that I would recommend you take a look at are, of course, AWS organizations with service control policies. I would also take a look at CloudTrail to make sure that you're ingesting audit data, and also make sure that you're using AWS Config to build custom compliance rules so that you can enforce those guardrails around your standardized resource configurations, and that your resource configurations are not drifting by accident or intentionally away from whatever your organizational standards are. This has just been a brief video to review some of the management and governance services in AWS. I hope this has been helpful for you, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.